We're going to look at the crucifixion and the burial of Jesus. What we have up here on the screen is a picture of Gordon's Calvary from I'm not sure when this picture was dated, but probably dated sometime between 1888 and 1912. That's the best guesses that people have with this particular picture. But as you can see right here in the middle, that is the skull, the face of the skull that caught everybody's eye at the end of the 19th century, and thinking that this was perhaps the place where Jesus was crucified. To get our mind in the right place, why don't we think about the last week of Jesus' life? On Sunday, he goes into Jerusalem. As you know, it's Palm Sunday. It's a triumphal entry into Jerusalem, the laying down of the palm leaves, of victory, the recognizing of a king, son of David. Jesus weeps over the city as he comes up over the top of the Mount of Olives on that road that, as we've seen, still exists. It's been paved over, and there are houses that run up and down it, but that same road that existed during the time of Jesus still exists to this day. It's been around for a couple of thousand years, and there's a great contrast between the joy of Palm Sunday as he's being recognized by the people, and the tears that he weeps over the city. And it's during this particular down moment as Jesus looks over the city of Jerusalem that he talks about not one stone will be left on top of another, with the pronouncement of judgment on Jerusalem in John 12. And then Monday rolls around, and in the morning as he's going to the city, after coming back that night after the triumphal entry, he curses the fig tree. And there is the cleansing of the temple in Matthew 21, Mark 11, Luke 19. John's gospel records the cleansing of the temple at the very beginning of the gospel, the beginning of Jesus' ministry. The synoptics put it at the end. And he goes and he finds that the temple place has not become a place of worship and prayer, not just for the Jews, but for all peoples. He finds that it's become a den of robbers, and that people are going in with their hearts smudged a little bit with anger and disappointment at the way that they have been treated, with the way that coins have been traded for the temple tax, for the way that animals have been bought and sold, and the price gouging that was involved there in Solomon's portico. And he cleanses, he runs all of those people out. The chief priests, the teachers of the law, the leaders among the people who have been so divided with each other religiously, at least find commonality and find some sense of unity in the fact that they all of them want to kill Jesus. And it's at this point that Jesus teaches about his death, about the seed in John 12, that as long as it abides by itself, nothing great happens, but once that seed is put into the ground and it dies, it bears much fruit. And Jesus teaches about the meaningfulness of his death. And then on Tuesday, as they're going back out in the morning to the city, there's the teaching about the fig tree and what it means. Peter says, hey, look, the fig tree that you cursed is withered. And there's some teaching about what that means in light of what Jesus is encountering in Judaism as he goes each day to the Temple Mount. The question about his authority, and the religious enemies of Jesus are wanting to know, by what authority are you doing all of this and teaching all of this? And he says, well, here, let me ask you a question, and then I'll tell you. And he says, John the Baptist, was he from man or was he from God? And, is he a prophet? And they reason among themselves, if they say he's from God, then Jesus is going to say, why don't you listen to him then? Especially in light of what he says about me. But if he says the religious leaders say that he's from men, then the people will get upset with them because they held that John was a prophet. He tells the parable. And what's really interesting about this when you read the Gospels over and over and over and over again, you sense in this last week of Jesus' life that there's a little ramping up and a little increase in the confrontational, challenging nature of his teaching. The parable of the two sons. Which one is more obedient? The one, when the father comes and says, will you go out and work in the vineyard? One son says, yeah, I'll go. I'm all in. But he never shows up. The other son goes, no, I got better things to do. But then later on realizes that his father had made a request of him and family and all these kinds of things, and he goes back. Which one of them is obedient? The parable of the wicked tenants. I mean, you don't have to read very deeply these 20 centuries later to understand what he's saying. He's trying to be as clear as possible. Here is this vineyard that has been entrusted by an owner to some human beings. Time comes, he sends servant after servant after servant after servant for the rent and the goods and everything that's been agreed upon. And the tenants, no. Finally, he sends his son. Surely they'll listen to my son. And the tenants are going, no, we're not going to listen to him. In fact, we've been given a golden opportunity. If we kill him, we're going to completely free ourselves up. They still are not getting the point. There's the question of paying taxes to Caesar. The famous line, render unto things that are made in Caesar's image. The Sadducee question about marriage and the resurrection. Sadducees, very educated people. They are the aristocracy. They think that this question on marriage and resurrection is going to put Jesus in his place and show him to be a fraud to everybody. And so they say, here's this woman married to a guy. He dies, no children. She ends up marrying all of his brothers. They all die before giving her children. And then she dies. They go to heaven. Whose wife does she belong? Whose wife is she? And Jesus, and they're laughing to themselves because they don't believe in the resurrection and all of this stuff anyway. And Jesus says, you do not understand in the least Scripture or the power of God. And goes on to explain, and gives his answer to their question. At the end of this chapter, though, in Matthew chapter 22, there is the question about the greatest command. There's all this going back and forth and debates and parables and all these kinds of things. And finally, somebody says, "What is the greatest command?" And Jesus says, "Well, it's to love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. And a second is like it. Love your neighbor as yourself." All the prophets hang on this, meaning that when you read Torah, you read the prophets, you read the wisdom lit, that these are the two commands that float to the top. The greatest commandment, to love God and to love your neighbor. And then Wednesday rolls around, Jesus' question to the Pharisees about the Christ. And there are times when you sense that the answer that Jesus is giving is an answer on not only how to think, but to consider how you read the Word. And this particular question out of Psalm 110 is, who is the father of the Messiah? Well, it's David. Well, if David is, the father of the Messiah, the grandfather of the Messiah, then why does he call him Lord? And everybody stops, and some people they think that's one of the most marvelous things that Jesus has ever said to the religious leaders. Religious leaders are baffled. But then you have the woes that are pronounced on the Pharisees. And in Matthew chapter 23, it's woe after woe after woe after woe after woe. And you really feel the tension kind of beginning to ramp up in Jerusalem that last week of Jesus' life as they're approaching Passover. And it's in Matthew chapter 23 that he refers to the Pharisees. Now in the Sermon on the Mount, chapter 5, verse 20, he has said, your righteousness has to surpass the scribes and the Pharisees if you're going to enter the kingdom of God. Here he's pronouncing the woe on them, that they're whitewashed tombs. They look good on the outside, but their righteousness is only on the outside. It's not on the inside. They're like dead men's bones. They travel over land and sea to proselyte one person, but they have done nothing significant for that person that they have proselytized. And there is that series of woes. And then as he's up in the temple area, there's the widow's 2 small copper coins and faith that is so impressive to him. And then in Matthew chapter 24, the discourse on the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus has said some things that make them think that this is the end of the world. The idea of the destruction of Jerusalem. And Jesus gives them the teaching that really pertains to AD 70 when the Romans come in, they tear everything down. But it's going to look to the Jews like the destruction of the world. And of that day, that they're referring to, the end of the world, he says nobody knows. And he goes into the parables of the parable of the wise and the foolish virgins. You don't know when the bridegroom is coming. So don't be like the foolish ones who didn't care about being watchful or being good stewards of oil or anything like that. And when the bridegroom comes, they find themselves unprepared and thus locked out of the wedding feast. But to be like the wise ones who knew what they were doing, who were being prepared, who were being good stewards, who were being watchful. And when the bridegroom arrived, they were ready to receive him. The parable of the talents. And then that great scene of judgment that Jesus talks about with the goats and the sheep in Matthew chapter 25, where humanity, the angels are going to come and gather everybody, and goats on the left, sheep on the right. And the goats are the people whose lives do not reflect in any degree whatsoever the kingdom of God. The sheep, on the other hand, they're the ones who, I was hungry and you fed me. I was naked and you clothed me. I was in prison and you visited me. All of these things. And they respond, when did we see you like this? And when you did this to one of these, you did it to me. It was just a natural part of the way that they lived. And there's the plot to arrest Jesus and to kill him. The anointing of Jesus with perfume that evening back on the Mount of Olives. And then Judas makes his bargain to betray Jesus. And the 30 pieces of silver come into play. And then on Thursday, Jesus gives instructions for the Passover preparation. Josephus says that there are four philosophies, major philosophies of Judaism during the time of Jesus. We've talked about this before. There is the Pharisees, Sadducees, there's the Zealots, and there are the Essenes. And the Essenes are not really on the biblical text in anywhere, except on this Thursday in which Jesus is giving instructions for Passover preparation. And he talks about a man who will be carrying a bucket of water. And the only group of folk in Israel that would have done something like that would have been the Essenes. Women are the ones that would be carrying the water. And so many of the scholars believe that the Essene presence in Jerusalem was probably in this particular area where the Passover was prepared for Jesus and his disciples. It's Jesus washing the disciples' feet in an act of love. John tells us at the beginning of John 13 that he knew what was in their hearts. He knew he was going back to the Father. And he loved his disciples to the very end, and knowing what was on their hearts with their struggles about who was going to be the greatest and the right hand, the left hand, and all of this, when Jesus came into his kingdom, he does something so shockingly surprising to them that the room is just silent. He gets up, takes off his shirt and wraps a towel around his waist and begins to wash the disciples' feet. And that gets everybody's attention. And he begins to talk to them about the kingdom. And, unfortunately, there's going to be one that is going to betray him. And knowing that everything is ramping up towards his death, he's been teaching them about the cross. They're still struggling with the idea of the cross. They're still struggling with the idea of the resurrection. And in their anxiety and trying to figure this out and all of the angst that they're feeling, because, when the leader of the band is executed, that means that the members of the band are going to be executed as well, or at least are going to have some kind of punishment or hardship that is pushed on them. And in their hearts, they begin to ask, surely not I. Or they're asking out loud, because in their hearts of the struggle, surely not I, surely not I, surely not I. And it's here that Jesus begins to give instructions on the meal, the bread and the wine. The bread represents the body that he's giving. The wine represents the blood that he is shedding. It's a new covenant. And there's the final discourse, the new commandment. You've heard them said you should love your neighbor, but I say, love each other as I have loved you. The discussion about Peter being sifted by Satan, and Peter says, I'll never do it. And he says, before the rooster crows, you're going to deny me 3 times. It's also in this period of time where, he knows that they are anxious and they're troubled. He says, don't let your hearts be troubled, but trust God, trust me. And the answer to troubled hearts, because of death, is, my Father has many rooms. And I'm going to come back, and I'm going to get you and take you to be where I am. And they sing a hymn. and they go to the Garden of Gethsemane, and there are the prayers of Christ in the garden. And then late Thursday night, early Friday morning, sometime right after midnight, Judas arrives with the chief priest detachment of soldiers, the Pharisees, the betrayal by Judas with a kiss. Everything gets kind of raw there, and everybody is on edge. Peter draws his sword, cuts off the high priest's servant's Malchus's ear. Jesus rebukes him and reattaches that ear and heals him. He is bound. They take him over to Annas' house where he's examined. Peter is going to be in the middle of denying Jesus' trial by the high priest Caiaphas. They rent their clothes, and there's the pronouncement of blasphemy, and Jesus is beaten. There's a scene in the Passion of Christ is very upsetting, and that is at this particular. It's all upsetting. Don't get me wrong, but somehow this was such a tender-hearted moment for me, is when he stood there and they lined up to spit on him and to strike him in the face, and he just took it, and he's bound. Early the next morning, he's taken to Pilate, and in his conversation with Pilate, the famous question, "What is truth?" It's during this period of time that Judas commits suicide, and Jesus is taken to Herod Antipas. Pilate is not dumb. He is a career civil servant, and he knows that this is a Jewish matter. And Herod Antipas, who he was not particularly close to, really did not like him at all, and the feeling was mutual. But he's in town. He's at his palace. And so he has Jesus taken to Herod Antipas, hoping that, okay, a Jew will take care of a Jewish matter. And Herod Antipas is a little, you sometimes get the feeling that Herod Antipas is just a little unhinged a little bit emotionally. He wants Jesus to perform a miracle for him. And they end up mocking Jesus and taunting him, and they send him back to Pilate. And Friday is in full swing, and he's before Pilate, and Pilate recognizes that there's nothing that Jesus has done that deserves death. And on top of that, his wife has come to him and said, "Have nothing to do with this good man. These dreams that trouble me have nothing to do with him." And so Pilate, because he is a career civil servant, he understands politics. And he says, "Okay, here's my way out. He doesn't deserve death, but the Jews want him dead. Here's a way out. I'm going to march Charles Manson out in front of the people and Jesus, and I'm going to ask, which one would you like for me to free?" Thinking, who wants Charles Manson, this Barabbas, insurrectionist and murderer, want him out on the streets, not only because of the danger that he is to the Jewish population, but he gets the Romans riled up. And the crowd begins to cry, "Give us Charles Manson. Give us Charles Manson. Give us Charles Manson. Crucify him, crucify him, crucify him." Well, because he is a career civil servant, he's not going to be just outdone with one failure in his political maneuvering here. So he takes Jesus to the Praetorium, and Jesus is literally, brutally beat to a pulp. These beatings sometimes would result in the death of the person being beaten. And the ends of these leather thongs that were a part of the flagellum would have pieces of bone, sharp pieces of bone or metal. They would strike, and the leather thong would wrap itself around the body and hook itself like a hook with a barb into the skin. And then those Romans who were adept at torture would just rip that flagellum, and the skin would come with it, and they beat him and they beat him and they beat him. He is unrecognizable, and he stands him up in front of the people and saying, "Is this enough?" And they say, "No, crucify him, crucify him." And at this point, Pilate is fearful that things are going to get out of hand, and he goes to the Golgotha, which is the stone pavement where the judge's seat is located, and he says he's going to send Jesus to Golgotha. And Jesus is carrying his cross to the place of execution, and in his exhausted, sleepless, dehydrated, beaten, bloody state is unable to carry his cross, and the Romans are not going to do it for him. They pull this guy out of the crowd, a guy by the name of Simon of Cyrene, whose kids become disciples of Jesus and are mentioned at the end of the Gospel of Mark, one of Paul. Barry, which letter is it that has Rufus? Is it Colossians? The kids of Simon of Cyrene? Do you remember?
Sounds good.
Sounds good. I forgot. It's one of Paul's letters. They carry the cross. Simon carries the cross for him. The crucifixion was just this awful. It was the most brutal way to die. It was horrific. Even the Romans were horrified. It would not allow a Roman citizen. It was illegal for a Roman citizen to be crucified. Jesus is offered wine and myrrh, which he refuses. It was just a little bit of humanity to kind of deaden it a little bit. Jesus is crucified between two criminals, and King of the Jews was put on top of the cross. And the Jews say, no, he's not King of the Jews. Say, I said I was the King of the Jews. And Pilate says, nope, I've written what I've written. And it's here, and Jesus, prays, Father, forgive them for what they don't know they're doing. And would be horrific if they ever understood what they were doing in this very moment. Jesus' clothes are divided among the soldiers, and the people are passing by. The passerbys are hurling insults at him. Come down from the cross if you're the Son of God. This was so humiliating, and we'll talk about this in a little bit, but the Romans would put their crosses in places where people would see it. And it would be humiliating to be, in America we talk about dying with dignity. And the fact of the matter is, when the body begins to fail, dignity kind of goes out the window. And to die like that, to be stripped of everything, and to be suffered the way that a person in crucifixion does, and then to have it done, where people, and the worst of the worst are the ones that are being crucified, to be mocked and taunted the way that they were. It was a horrific way to die. And even the thieves in Matthew 27 are mocking him, only for one to have a change of heart in Luke 23 and rebukes the other one. And Jesus instructs John about his mother. There's darkness from the 6th hour to the 9th hour. At the 9th hour, he cries out the beginning words of Psalm 22 in Aramaic, Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani? My God, why have you forsaken me? He says, I'm thirsty. They hand up to him a sponge that has wine and vinegar. And then Father, into your hands I commit my spirit. And then he says, it is finished. And the temple is torn from top to bottom. So earthquake and the rocks split. Tombs break open in Matthew's gospel, and the bodies of the dead are raised to life. Centurion is watching all of this and says, surely he was the Son of God. And the Jews ask, because the Passover is coming, special Sabbath preparation to all these kinds of things that have to be done. The Jews ask for the legs of the crucified to be broken in order to speed it up. One of the things, not only was it painful and not only was it a humiliating way to die, but it just took forever. And because of the Passover and all of that coming up, the Jews asked for the legs of the crucified to be broken in order to speed up the death. When somebody was crucified, they didn't die from blood loss. They suffocated. Their arms are outstretched as far as they will go. Their legs are pinned, and they have to raise themselves up to breathe. And with the lactose acid that would build up, and the burn, plus the fluid building up around the heart, and all of that. I mean, it's just absolutely one of the most agonizing ways to die. And it just took forever. And so the Jews asked for the legs of the crucified to be broken because of Passover. But to their surprise, the soldiers discover that Jesus is already dead. And and Nicodemus, I think is wonderful, but Joseph of Arimathea, I think, is one of the bravest men who ever lived. There's nothing really about him. We know about Nicodemus in John chapter 3, but Joseph of Arimathea, the Arimathea family was from Ramallah, which was north of Jerusalem, and very famous, rich family. And obviously very politically connected, and this man, after witnessing how the crowds, the multitudes of people had turned on Jesus, approaches Pilate and says, "I'd like the body." I just think that is one of the most compassionate things in the Bible, that this Joseph was brave enough and courageous enough and full of faith enough in who Christ said that he was, that he would go in an act of not just bravery but in tenderness with Nicodemus. They would take the body and receive it, and because of the need to get it done before Shabbat started that evening, they would hastily wrap the body and put it into a tomb. The Arimathea family, there was a quarry outside of Jerusalem. The thought is that in this quarry, the Arimatheas there was found that they owned some property or had some interest in the quarry, and that this was probably where the tomb was that had been hollowed out. And they collect Jesus' body to be prepared for burial, and it was placed in a new tomb by the Arimatheas. The place where Jesus was beaten with the flagellum was there at the Fortress Antonia in the center, the big courtyard. You remember that it was buttressed up against the northwest end of the temple there in Jerusalem, and they had these four, it was a perfect square, and in each of the corners there were these towers. The towers were high enough for them to be able to look in and to see what was happening in the Temple Mount during these Passovers and the Festival of Tabernacles and the great festivals, because there was always the idea that the Messiah was going to reveal himself. And in between those four columns was this open courtyard, and that would be the area where Jesus was beaten into the dirt with a flagellum. These are part of the stones that go back to that time. The stone pavement where the judgment seat of Pilate would have been located. Some of these stones do not go quite as far back as the time of Jesus, but they do go back to that era. And not only do you have them, but you have etched into those stones, and none of this is open to the sky, even though it would have been during the time of Jesus. All of this is undercover now, and you can only kind of walk across it on special piers that go across it. But this would have been the game. It's called the King's Game, and it would have been a game that would have been played by the soldiers, where they would roll die made out of lamb's knuckles, and would have bargained and gambled for the clothing or the goods or anything of worth of the person that was being crucified. And there was no purpose to this game except to humiliate even more so the person that was about to be crucified. A better picture of it is here. This one is probably from about 130, so 100 years or so maybe after the time of Jesus, but this is what that game would have looked like during the time of Jesus, when they are throwing, they're drawing lots and playing the game for his stuff. This is the first century Damascus Gate. If Jesus had been crucified at Gordon's Calvary, this would have been the gate that he would have gone out of. You go right across the street, and you're in the Garden Tomb area, that park, as well as Gordon's Calvary. But then that's the bridge up at the top with the people on it. That's the Damascus Gate today from the Old City. The Old City is just really wonderful. When you go through it, you make sure that you have you don't put your hand in your pocket. You put your hand in your pocket and hold your wallet. It's a very dangerous place for pickpockets. But as you go through it, there are just piles of spices. The cumin and turmeric and all of the garlic and all of these different spices, and if you close your eyes, you really do get transported to the first century, and it's you just kind of wonder if that was the inspiration for Old Spice deodorant. But it's this would have been the gate that he would have come through, and that's the modern. I say modern, probably. I think this one was built during the conquest or the Crusades. And then everybody has heard of the Via Dolorosa. I slipped this slide in here. That's the entrance to the Garden Tomb. But this is the picture of that sign just now, the Via Dolorosa, in Hebrew and Aramaic and in English. And I was pretending to take a picture of the sign so I could take a picture of the soldiers and their guns without raising a whole lot of attention. But wherever you go in the old city and really around Israel, you find guys, the IDF, the Israeli Defense Force, standing around making sure that everybody is protected. Also, look at the stones that these guys are standing on. Again, this is the old city. I mean, these stones are ancient stones. There are basically two places, Gordon's Calvary and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, that are the main sites for the crucifixion, Calvary and Golgotha. Golgotha is Aramaic. When Jerome, down at the bottom of the Church of the Nativity in Bethlehem, was bringing together the Latin Vulgate version of the Bible, the Latin word that he used for the Aramaic word Golgotha was the word Calvary. And so that's where Calvary is just the Latin word for Golgotha, the place of the skull. And the Church of the Holy Sepulchre is a church. It's a conglomeration of Roman Catholic, Greek Orthodox, Armenian Apostolic Church, the Syrians, the Coptics, who are from North Africa, and the Ethiopians. All six of those religious traditions and their churches kind of merge on this spot. And this is why. In the early 4th century, Constantine is about to go to battle. And he has a vision of a cross in the sky and a voice that says, follow this symbol, follow this symbol. And he's given the victory in the battle. He becomes a Christian. He signs the Edict of Milan, which makes Christianity sort of the state religion. And he sends his mother back to Israel some 3 centuries after the fact. But 3 centuries after the time of Jesus, he has sent his mother back to find the cross, or the place where he was crucified, as well as the tomb. And so there was, during the time of Constantine, his mother coming. She gets with Eusebius, famous bishop of Caesarea, as well as Macarius, who is the bishop of Jerusalem. And they find a hill, a rock hill, where they find, as legend has it, 3 crosses. Not too far from it. In fact, you can see this is not very far at all. They find a place that looks like a tomb with an anteroom in the front of it. And she asks, is this it? And they say, it's got to be. And so they build the church, what is known as the Holy Sepulchre Church, which has been torn down and built, and torn down and built, and torn down and built over the centuries. But all 6 of these religious groups have built this church over this area to signify the importance of the crucifixion of Jesus and his resurrection. Station 10. Now, if we go back, this area, you've heard of the 14 stations of the cross. This area right here is known as Station 10. Station 10 is the place where Jesus would have been stripped of his garments, if this is the place, and if this is the order in which things happened. Church tradition says that this is the area. And again, is this the area? What makes this place interesting is that it goes back to the 3rd century. The argument against the Holy Sepulchre as being the place, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre as being the place where Jesus was crucified, was that it was inside the city walls. The problem with that argument, though, is that it was actually, for at least 10 years after the time of Jesus, it was outside the city wall until the 3rd wall was built around the city by Antipas. And so, the possibility of there being this place is very, very remote. I mean, it was discovered 3 centuries after the fact. There was no reason why any of the Christians would have commemorated the garden tomb anyway, because he had resurrected, and they thought that they had Jesus with them anyway. So, it's very, very dubious. But when you go to Israel and you go to this place, this area right here where you see a cross, this place right here signifies the place where Jesus was stripped of his garments. Station 11 is as you go into the church itself and you're headed to the place where the cross of Jesus would have been sitting on Golgotha. This is the area, this mosaic is a reminder that Jesus was nailed to the cross. In 68, on the outskirts of the city, archaeologists found a tomb that is the only evidence of a crucifixion in first century Jerusalem. Now, there were crucifixions all over the place in the Roman Empire, but there's only been one solid crucifixion site that has been discovered from the first century. And what they discovered in that is that crosses were not tall at all, being made of olive wood. When you look at all, has anybody here, do you remember the movie King of Kings? Max von Sydow is Jesus of Nazareth. He is crucified. I mean, he's 10 feet up in the air. Even in the Passion of the Christ, Jesus is up in the air. But what this first century crucifixion evidence shows is that the crosses were not very tall at all because they were made of olive wood. And olive trees are not that tall. So instead of being 6, 7, 8 feet off the ground, Jesus was probably maybe 1 or 2 feet off the ground when he was crucified. It's also from this site that they discovered that, yes, nails were driven through the forearms, not the palms. They were driven through the forearms and not the wrists or palms in order for them to stick and not to be yanked out by the weight of the body or by the force of people trying to get off of the cross in the horror of the death. There was a seat that would support the buttocks, and there was a spike that was driven through the foot and a block of wood in order to make it more difficult for the foot. If your foot is put at a really odd angle and just nailed into the wood, chances are, just by the force of weight, it's going to be ripped off. But if the foot is put on a block so that it's in a more natural angle, and then the nail is sent through it, the likelihood of nothing being ripped out or anything like that is going to happen. And so Station 11, as you go into this church, is a reminder that Jesus was crucified and that the nails were driven. As you can see, they're through the palms, and they got the block upright. I don't think there's a block of wood for the little seat, but he would have been crucified with the nails through the forearms. And then this is the place, Station 12, is where Jesus dies on the cross. And there's underneath, on the other side of the altar here, is a star that is where Jesus would have been crucified, with black dots on either side of it, which would have been the place where the thieves were crucified on either side of him. And as you're looking at this site right here, and you look to the right and down, what you see is this. You see a rock. And this split right here is reminiscent of what part of Jesus' crucifixion? The earthquake, where the rocks were split. And so, all of this goes into the site being considered, one of perhaps the places where Jesus could have been crucified. This is as you can see, there's a gigantic rotunda right here. And inside of the rotunda is this structure right here. And this is built over the site where the tomb would have been, where Jesus was crucified. And if you'll remember in the schematic, there was kind of an anteroom, and then there was the vault where they say Jesus would have been buried. That vault area, that anteroom area, is a chapel now known as the Chapel of the Angels. And this is where the angel said, "Why are you looking for him?" to Mary in John 20. And so that's the vault of the angels, or the chapel of the angels. But you can go in there, and again, you know, when you have this much stone, this much rock, this much architecture, this much ornateness, you know, you feel like you're insulated away from the place that was actually there. Again, dubious that this is the place where Jesus was crucified. So if you walk out the Damascus gate and outside that wall, and you cross this street, this is Sultan Suleiman Street. These streets have the name of Islamic famous people because this is a Muslim quarter. If you go across this street and then cut back over to this direction, you come to the entrance of the Garden Tomb. And from the Garden Tomb, you can see, and this is one of the ancient pictures of, in fact, you can buy copies of this if you want to get it framed in your house. They're in the Garden of Tomb Tourist and Gift Shop. And as you can see, you know, this was the thing that Gordon thought was, and he's not the one that discovered it. It was actually, I believe, a Swedish archaeologist that related onto him. He comes, he's a British Army officer. He doesn't, you know, he's a very educated man. He uses the tools of his profession, but he becomes convinced that this is the place where Jesus has been crucified. There is some evidence that it was a place of execution, but nothing for certain. This is the road that goes to Damascus. This picture was taken in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Here's another picture of it from a higher spot. You can see the camel caravan, and this is Gordon's Calvary right here. And I believe that the archaeologists have found evidence of executions, not by crucifixion necessarily, but people being bound and then dropped off of this head first and being executed that way. It was a Roman place of execution. This is what it looks like today. When we were there in 16, when I was there in 99 and there in 2000, you could see what we were looking at in those ancient pictures. This is what it looks like today. When we were there in 16, there was an ice storm that hit Jerusalem a couple of years before, and the nose piece got covered up in a block of ice, and it literally fell off. And so it's a little bit distorted, but this is what you see today. These would be the eye sockets. The nose would have been here and the mouth down in that. And this is the Garden Tomb. The Crusaders found this place. It fit what they considered to be the New Testament record. Archaeology, cemeteries evolve, and not just in the modern age. Tombs evolved during the time of Jesus as well. And the tombs that go back to the first century are different from this particular tomb in the way that it was set up. But the Crusaders found this. There was, and you can see, this is one of the things that everybody wants to do. But when they get close to it, they want to stick their head over to see the gutter there that a gigantic stone would have been placed in to roll in front of the tomb. And so it fit, the stone being rolled in front of it. It was carved out of rock. It's in the area of a quarry, all of these kinds of things. And inside of it, there is a Crusader cross that was painted in the 12th century to commemorate this place. And again, this is not the Garden Tomb. It looks similar, but not exactly like the tomb that Jesus would have been put in the way that it would have been designed. But it goes back at least to the time of the Crusaders. And this piece of art right here, even though it's very simple, is priceless because not only of what it represents, but how old it is and why it was put there. And here's another picture of it. And that is the last week of Jesus' life and his crucifixion, the two big places, the Church of the Holy Sepulchre and Gordon's Calvary or Gordon's Golgotha are the places that in the main are considered, that's at least where people are taken to as the place where Jesus was crucified. The Garden Tomb area is a much more popular place, especially for Protestants to go to think about the resurrection of Jesus. In 16, we did not go to the Church of the Holy Sepulchre. We go there. We've been there the first 2 trips. The third trip we took, we didn't go there. We spent more of our time in the garden area and at Gordon's Calvary. But that's it. Next week we're going to look at the Herodium and Qumran. And the week after that, which will be our last class, we're going to look at Masada. And we'll see you Easter Sunday.